Hey y'all, I'm so excited y'all could be here. I know that I took like a month off. We have a lot going on. I am about 4 months pregnant, so getting through the not feeling good phase, and then we went on a vacation, which must blah, which was much needed. Like, let's be honest. We got to hang out with friends and just spend time as a family, and that was pretty awesome. But I'm back, and here we are, and we're going to jump right on into today's case that is kind of just a little bit of a crazy one. So, miscarriage of justice is a term that you hear often in TV dramas, but today's case is one of the reasons that this term truly exists. I am so thankful for programs like the Innocence Program, which is heavily involved in today's case. They help to prove the innocence of people who are wrongly convicted. Being a young newlywed is hard enough. Add that to the fact that your husband joins the Navy and goes off to serve his country. You, however, are so happy to be living the dream. You're married to your high school sweetheart and you're living your life as a happily married young couple. Unfortunately, your husband has to attend to his Navy duties and has to leave to go underway on a ship. This leaves you alone in your apartment, figuring it all out on your own for the first time. This is how it was for the beautiful young woman we're going to talk about today. Bill Bosco was only 19 years old and had returned home from a short term at sea, and he was very excited to see his new wife and spend time with her. On July 8, 1997, Bill entered the home expecting to see Michelle waiting for him. Michelle was just 18 years old. She was looking forward to her future with her husband, and unfortunately, after only 3 months of marriage, Bill walked into his bedroom to find his wife had been murdered. Bill immediately ran out of his apartment and to the neighbor across the street, who was another sailor named Daniel Williams. Daniel was a newlywed himself, and his wife of 1 week, Nicole, was in treatment for cancer. His family was in town visiting the newlyweds, and they were actually getting ready to have dinner as a family when Bill knocked on the door. When Bill knocked, Daniel leaped into action. He called 911 and he went to the apartment with Bill to help cover Michelle's body with a blanket. Detective Ford arrived at the apartment and began to question Nicole and Daniel about their relationship with the neighbors. The police noted that the murder took place around 11:30 p.m. on July 7th. There was no sign of a break-in. The time was based on testimony from Michelle's friend, Tamika, who said that they were out around noon until about 11:30. Michelle's friend also told the detectives that Daniel had a crush on Michelle, and the investigation quickly turned to his direction. He was asked to go to the police station and answer questions, and the police even told him that if he drove himself, he would be able to go home, and there would be no problems. This was a lie. Detective Ford, who actually had disciplinary actions taken against him for coercion, kept Daniel in the interrogation room for 9 hours. Asking him if he had raped and killed Michelle, he told Daniel that he had an eyewitness putting him at the scene, and he would face the death penalty if he did not confess to the crime. Daniel participated in a lie detector test, which he passed, but Ford still told him that he had failed. Daniel had a full alibi, which was his wife and his family, as his parents were still in town. And his parents told the police that the night of the murder, they were all together. However, Detective Ford just didn't believe him. After 9 hours of hard interrogation, Daniel ended up confessing and signing a confession to the rape and murder of Michelle. He stated that he had raped and murdered her by punching and beating her with his shoe while the interrogation of a seemingly innocent man was happening. Michelle's body was being autopsied. When the coroner's report came back, it showed that Michelle had been strangled and stabbed. The stab wounds were uniform in depth and clustered together. This showed that the pattern was consistent with one assailant, and there was always the possibility of more. With these new findings, Daniel's confession no longer lined up, but instead of looking for another suspect, as Tamika had mentioned more than just Daniel as a possible suspect when she talked to the police, they stuck to their guns that Daniel was guilty, and the police, led by Detective Ford, returned to Daniel and had him write and sign a new confession that reflected the findings of the coroner. With Daniel in custody, they stopped looking at any other leads that may have been there. However, forensic testing had not come back yet on the skin underneath Michelle's nails and on fluids that were found on Michelle herself and the blanket nearby. On December 11th of 1997, the DNA would come back, and it was negative for Daniel's DNA. Besides the DNA not matching, there was no evidence linking Daniel to this crime. His fingerprints and shoe prints did not match those found at the scene, and instead of deciding that this meant that he was innocent and had falsified his confession, they dug their heels in deeper. Daniel and his attorney were unaware of the new DNA match until April 30th of 1998. And in January of 1998, they offered him a plea bargain in exchange for a life sentence, but he refused. Unfortunately, during all of this time that Daniel was in jail, his wife Nicole did end up passing away due to her ovarian cancer that she had been fighting in November of 1997. Daniel requested to suppress his confession days after his wife's death, but the motion was denied. At this point, they decided that Daniel did not work alone, but instead he had an accomplice. Daniel and Nicole had a roommate at the time of the murder, and his name was Joseph Dick. Joseph was also a sailor assigned to a ship named the USS Saipan. He was a shipmate of Daniel's, and the police arrested Joseph as a suspect and brought him in. Joseph denied having anything to do with the murder. Joseph was described as a shy person and a late bloomer in life. He told the police that he was on duty the night of the murder. Duty is where you stand on the ship and you stay there for 24 hours straight and perform upkeep of the ship as well as security and just making sure that nothing is going on that shouldn't be going on. He was checked in the logbook on the ship, and he was never questioned whether he checked out. His senior chief confirmed that he was on the ship the whole night, and Joseph was kept in interrogation for 8 hours with Detective Ford. They never went to the USS Saipan to see if anybody had seen Joseph that night or knew if Joseph was actually on duty and didn't just check in. However, you can't just check in and then leave when you're on duty. That's not how it works. There are checks and balances, and they would know if you were not there. He was told that no one could confirm that he was on this ship. Again, they never even went to question anyone to see if he was on the ship. Detective Ford told him, just like he told Daniel, that he had failed a polygraph that he had in fact passed. Worn down just like Daniel, he signed a confession to the rape and murder of Michelle. His DNA was collected and sent off to the lab to be analyzed. And in March of 1998, Joseph's DNA came back negative to the DNA found on Michelle's body. February of 1998, a competency evaluation was requested for Daniel. He told the police that he was innocent and he had made a false confession. The police believed that Daniel and Joseph were covering for another party involved. So now they're saying there must have been somebody else because the DNA doesn't match. So they must have been covering for someone else. They asked Joseph to identify the man that they were covering for and who else was involved. And he identified a man named George Clark. However, there was no man named George Clark that they could find in the area or that knew them or anything like that. Since they couldn't find George Clark, they brought out photographs of sailors in a Navy yearbook, which I feel is so wrong. Like, this is the definition of coercion and false identification. So they brought out this Navy yearbook and they sat it in front of Joseph. And they asked him to identify the other man that was involved. He then, through the pictures, picked out a man named Derek Tice, saying that he was the man involved. Derek was described as a loving, generous person, and he grew up with a brother who also had cancer. Derek was said to stand up for others around him, including his brother, and almost a year passed when Derek was brought in from Florida, where he was now stationed, back to Virginia. Detective Ford went to get Derek himself, and once they had him in custody, they interrogated Derek for 11 hours. Derek maintained his innocence as long as he possibly could. He requested a lawyer, which was denied. He was threatened with the death penalty, and he was lied to by Detective Ford on multiple occasions. After enduring 11 hours of the same interrogation tactic used on the other men, Derek confessed to the crime. He also implicated other sailors as accomplices, because I guess we're all just going down for this one, right? It did gather Derek's DNA as well at the time of his interrogation. The other 4 sailors were Eric Wilson, John Pauley, Jeffrey Ferris, and John Denser. All men involved were at this point being charged with capital murder and rape. John and Jeffrey never confessed to the crime, and in fact, John was shown to be hundreds of miles away due to bank statements, where he lived and he worked at the time of the crime. And we're not sure why this alibi was checked and believed, but no other alibi really was checked. August 1998, John and Jeffrey were indicted on the charges due to Joseph stating that they were involved but never stabbed her. Their attorney did, however, question the theory of multiple assailants, but the judge still indicted them. John Denser was actually retired from the Navy as well, and he was living 300 miles away in Pennsylvania. He denied being involved in the crime, and he did show paperwork proof that he was in Pennsylvania at the time of the murder. But he was also indicted for the crime. Eric Wilson did confess to the rape, but not the murder. And all the sailors' DNA was gathered, and none of the DNA matched any DNA left at the scene. 7 men in total were now arrested and indicted on the charges of rape and capital murder for the crime that there was no physical evidence linking them to. Despite the fact that there was DNA at the scene, footprints, and an array of other things, these men could not be linked to the scene of the crime. They are now also saying that these 7 men entered the apartment unseen and unheard and raped and murdered a woman, leaving no evidence of their involvement behind. The apartment complex that they lived in was not a huge complex. It was one of those that had the apartments right across the hallway from each other and like the flight of stairs up to the next level. These were small apartments. It was a small area for 7 men to walk through unidentified and unseen into their bottom floor garden apartment. I just don't see how that's possible. Nobody saw them. The apartment itself was a small layout, and I'm pretty sure we lived in one that was very similar at one point. Had a very skinny hallway to the bedrooms and a small kitchen area. In November of 1998, Derek recanted his accusation against John Denser and retracted his own confession to the rape and murder. This information, however, was never passed to John's lawyer, and a month later, during the preliminary hearing, Derek reaccused John, and I'm sure that was just to cover his butt. At this point, he's scared. They're all scared. They don't know what's going to happen next because none of them actually committed this crime that we know of. Things did change in February of 1999, and a more defined DNA test was requested on the 7 men involved. This came back negative for all the men. This also helped John Denser, John Pauley, and Jeffrey. These 3 men were never tried, and the charges against them were eventually dropped. In true Detective Ford fashion, he still acted as if all 7 men were involved when he was at the trials of Eric and Derek in 1999 and 2000. Joseph and Daniel ended up pleading guilty per the guidance of their lawyers to avoid the death penalty because Detective Ford had been threatening them with the death penalty since the beginning, since 1997. They have been scared and they have been worried that they were going to be put to death for a crime that they never even committed. All men had retracted their confessions and stated that they were threatened and coerced by Detective Ford. With the guilty plea from Joseph and Daniel, they were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And they were never tried in front of a jury, which I think was to their disadvantage. I think if a jury had seen this trial and seen the lack of evidence and how the DNA tests all came back negative, I don't think that they would have been sentenced, but that's just my opinion. June 14th, 1999, Eric went to trial. His murder charges were acquitted, and he was convicted of rape. He had only confessed to rape. His lawyer brought to the attention of the jury that the DNA did not match for him at the scene of the crime, but the prosecution used a signed confession to their advantage. Eric at this point had recanted his confession, but it didn't matter. Based solely on his recanted confession, he was sentenced to 8.5 years in prison for rape in September of 1999. Due to the high-profile manner of the case, Derek Tice actually requested a change of venue, and instead of being tried in Norfolk, where the crime happened, he requested to be tried in Alexandria, Virginia. The trial began November 22nd, 1999. Derek pled not guilty, as he has always done. And he was also one who recanted his original confession. His lawyer, like Eric's, tried to use the non-matching DNA as proof of innocence, and Joseph was brought in to testify against Derek. Joseph at this point had already been sentenced due to his plea, and he was trying to cover his butt for a crime he didn't commit. Derek's trial was different though, because during his trial, all of the new suspects and old suspects were revisited and were brought into the mix during his trial. When Tamika brought up suspects in the beginning of the case, these were never looked into because they thought they had their man. They swore that Daniel was their man and he was the one who was going to be put away for this crime. But they decided to start looking into them. As a newlywed couple, the Boscos wanted to make friends in the area, and so they did this with their neighbors and other sailors. That's very typical for military families, to try to make friends and try to have other wives and sailors that they can spend time with as they are away from their family. One of their friends that they met was named Omar Ballard. They were friendly with Omar and had even had him over at their apartment a couple times before. Omar had assaulted a woman named Melissa Morse on June 27th of 1997 in the same apartment complex that the Boscos lived in. Omar was arrested January 15th of 1998 for the rape of a 14-year-old girl just 1 mile from the home of Michelle and Bill Bosco. He pled guilty to the rape of the 14-year-old girl. A month after pleading guilty to the rape, he pled guilty to the attack on Melissa Morse. He was sentenced to 41 years in prison for both attacks. While he sat in prison for the rape of the 14-year-old girl, he wrote to his family and friends. And on February 1999, one of those letters was brought into the police station, and in one of those letters it stated, "Remember the day I went to Mommy's house and the next morning Michelle was killed? Guess who did it? Me." March of 1999, he was questioned and confessed to the rape and murder after just 20 minutes of questioning. Police asked Omar if any of the other 7 men were involved, and he said no. They continued to question him, asking him if he knew the other men, and he said he knew Eric from jail, and they had asked him if he had ever talked to Daniel Williams, and he said no. As they asked again if anyone was with him during the crime, he said no. Omar not only confessed to the crime, but he had a criminal record for similar crimes, and he knew details that no one else knew about the scene of the crime. His story was consistent with all of the crime scene evidence, and he stated that Michelle allowed him into the apartment. He said he followed her down the hallway to her bedroom and raped her. He described the knife that was used in the murder. He also described her purse being dumped and something being taken from her purse, which no one else had mentioned. None of this was accurately described by any of the sailors who were being charged with the crime. DNA was taken from Omar to see if it was a match, and it was. That should have been it. That should have been done, but it wasn't. The police still thought that all of the men were involved, and they would not back down from this decision. They just added Omar to the mix. They said that it ended up being a gang rape and murder and that he was involved. Omar was offered a plea bargain and changed his story so it involved the other men. And in June of 1999, he was indicted for capital murder, rape, and robbery. All of this information was uncovered before Derek went to trial, and his defense team decided to use it in their favor. This didn't happen though, as the judge refused to allow the defense to include the confession of Omar in his trial. Derek's attorney was not even allowed to question Omar about his charges and his confession. And none of this was allowed to be submitted as evidence in the trial against Derek. There was a small win when the defense was allowed to question Detective Ford about his interrogation techniques, and none of this helped the case. February of 2000, Derek was found guilty, and in June he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. March of 2000, Omar pled guilty to rape and murder of Michelle in exchange for 2 consecutive life sentences. He associated the 4 sailors with his crime, and had he not made the plea bargain, he would have received a death sentence, according to the prosecution. So he made the plea bargain that involved the other sailors so that he wouldn't get the death penalty. I'm seeing a trend in this case of just not wanting to die with the death penalty. And so you're involving whoever you can to try to get yourself out of it. And that is not helping anyone involved whatsoever. In 2000, Eric did appeal and it was denied by the courts. In 2002, Derek appealed his conviction due to the fact that the attorney was not allowed to question Omar or see his written confession. This appeal was sent to a lower district court, and in January of 2003, Judge Poston who was the original judge who presided over the case and the retrial of Derek. So he presided over the original case, and then again he presided over the retrial of Derek. He said again he was not going to allow Omar's confession or questioning of Omar to be part of the trial, as he didn't feel like it was necessary. Derek was sentenced again to 2 consecutive life sentences. The men's case, however, was quickly going to make national headlines, and this would help. It gained the attention of the Innocence Project, which is a project I talked about in the beginning, and they became involved. The Innocence Project is a non-profit legal organization that is committed to exonerating individuals who have been wrongly convicted. They use DNA testing, and they are working to help reform the criminal justice system to prevent future injustices from happening. The Innocence Project is an amazing project, and I know it has helped a lot of people who have been wrongly convicted over the years. Derek's second conviction was overturned November 27, 2006, by the Virginia Circuit Court review on constitutional grounds of lack of adequate defense counsel. Judge Everett A. Martin concluded that police violated the well-established rule that once a suspect has invoked his right to remain silent, the police must stop questioning him. In addition, there was no fingerprints, no DNA, and no other scientific evidence that pointed that Derek was involved in this crime. No independent eyewitnesses implicated him, no physical evidence implicated him, and the judge explained all of this. The judge concluded that it was likely the jury would have acquitted Derek had the confession not been part of the trial, the confession that he revoked. The state of Virginia appealed the decision, making the conviction of Derek reinstated. September 14th, 2009, Derek filed a petition of habeas corpus with the United States District Court. United States District Judge Richard Williams removed Derek's conviction of rape and murder on the grounds that he was denied his constitutional right of effective counsel. On November 19th, 2009, it was ruled that Derek could be retried, and the state of Virginia appealed this as well. After completing 8.5 years of his sentence, Eric was released. So Eric ended up doing his full entire sentence after trying to appeal multiple times. He was required to be on the sex offender registry, and this status is great for actual sex offenders. Like, please, I'm all for it. It keeps people safe. However, it made it difficult for Eric as it limited where he could work, where he could live, and what he could do with his life. In 2010, he petitioned the U.S. District Court for a writ of habeas corpus challenging his conviction. The court refused to hear his case as he was no longer in prison. So, he wasn't on parole, he wasn't on probation, and he wasn't even on supervised release. He was just living his life. November 10th of 2005, November 10th of 2005, clemency was petitioned for the 3 remaining jailed sailors, and the governor at the time did not rule in the petition, but his successor considered it. In the consideration, they found that several retired FBI agents and 11 of the original convicting jurors thought that the men were innocent. The jurors went as far as to submit affidavits in support of the sailors' clemency. Eventually, about 10 former state attorney generals, more than 20 former FBI agents, and 13 of the original jurors in 2 of the cases publicly supported the innocence of the sailors. The men continued to fight for their freedom and prove their innocence, and on August 6th of 2009, Governor Kane granted a conditional pardon for Daniel, Joseph, and Derek. This would release them from prison, but it was not freedom or innocence. The men, like Eric, had to register as sex offenders, and they had to return to update their records. They had work restrictions, and they had restrictions on where they could live and all of their movements as well. In a turn of true justice, however, in May of 2010, former Detective Ford was indicted on unrelated extortion charges for accepting payments for years from suspects in return for favorable treatment. He was found guilty of these crimes, and after his conviction in 2013, attorneys for all 4 men called for full exonerations of their clients. The Virginia Attorney General did not file a response to this petition, but was ordered to do so by the Supreme Court by April 25th of 2013. June 24th, 2013, Eric was denied a writ of certiorari, and October 26th of 2016, U.S. District Judge John Gibney Jr. ruled that by any measure, the evidence showed that Daniel and Joseph did not commit the rape and murder to which they each pled guilty. No sane human being could convict them by the available evidence. After Virginia Attorney General Mark Herring conceded errors in the initial investigation and withdrew his office's long-standing opposition to their claims of innocence, Gibney vacated the convictions of Daniel and Joseph and exonerated them. The state withdrew all charges against them, and this case did open a lot of eyes to the misjustice that could happen behind closed doors. November of 2017, the Virginia Attorney General instructed Norfolk police to record all interrogations and confessions in cases related to homicide. The best vindication for these men came March 21st, 2017, when Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe granted the men absolute pardons. This pardon cleared their names and removed them from the sex offenders and felons registry. The governor made this statement: "These pardons close the final chapter on a grave injustice that has plagued these men for nearly 20 years. While former Governor Kane had initially granted conditional pardons in the case, more exculpatory information discovered since then and detailed by Judge John Gibney during exhaustive evidentiary proceedings indicate that absolute pardons are appropriate." A civil suit against the state was filed for wrongful conviction in December of 2018. Both jurisdictions settled and agreed to $4.9 million in compensation from the city of Norfolk and another $3.5 million from the state of Virginia were to be paid to the 4 men. Omar later recanted that the men helped him, and he still maintains that he committed the crime all by himself. This was a terrible miscarriage of justice that cost 4 innocent men everything. Daniel could not be at his wife's side when she was passing from cancer, and all of these men lost their military careers. For some, that may not seem like a big thing, but for many, their military careers mean everything. They lost years of their lives, years with their families, and they will never get that time back. These men were treated terribly by Virginia and the city of Norfolk, and especially Detective Ford. And this just brings to light how easily a miscarriage of justice like this can happen for anyone. But that's my case for today. I hope you all have a great day, have a great week, and I will be back this week with another, because I know this was supposed to go out on Saturday and then life happened. So I will be back again with another case this week. I hope you all have a great week. Stay safe out there. Be good. Eat your veggies and drink your water. Have a great day. Bye.